This is Richard, a billionaire who disguised himself as a waiter in his own restaurant. But what he didn't expect was that 3 words from a waitress would change everything. I was there. I saw it all happen. This is the story of my employer, Richard Sterling, a man who had billions but had no idea what was really happening in the restaurant he owned. Hello, I am the billionaire butler, and I want to welcome you as you listen to our story. Before we begin, please like this video and subscribe. Also tell us in the comments where you are watching from. I want to know. Boston, 1987. The Meridian was the kind of place where senators dined alongside technology magnates, where a reservation took 3 months, where I, as Richard's personal butler, had seen fortunes made and unmade over $1,000 bottles of wine. But something was wrong, very wrong, and Richard knew it. So on a Tuesday in March, he came to me with a plan that bordered on insanity. He would disappear, become David Morgan, an ordinary waiter, work alongside his own staff without anyone knowing who he really was. Just watch, he told me, and don't interfere, no matter what happens. I should have interfered, because what happened in those next few weeks, what that waitress said to him on a stormy night, destroyed the man I knew and created someone completely different. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, back when Richard Sterling still believed that money could solve any problem and that loyalty could be bought with a generous paycheck. It was late February when I first noticed the change in him. Richard had always been a man of routines. Wake at 5:30, work out for an hour, breakfast while reading the Wall Street Journal and the tech section of the Boston Globe. But that morning, he sat at the breakfast table with the restaurant's financial statements spread before him like a battlefield map, his coffee growing cold, untouched. "Jameson," he said without looking up. That was me. 42 years I'd been in service. The last 12 to Richard. Look at this, really look at it. I approached the table. Numbers swam across the pages, but even my untrained eye could see the pattern. Revenue was strong, exceptional even, but the profit margins were shrinking month by month, like ice melting in the sun. The Meridian should be printing money, Richard continued, his finger tapping a column of figures. We're booked solid 6 nights a week. We charge premium prices. Our food costs are in line with industry standards, so where is it all going? I had no answer. Richard had purchased the Meridian 3 years prior in 1984, shortly after selling his software company to IBM for a sum that made headlines in the business pages. He'd wanted something tangible, he'd told me, something he could see and touch and shape with his own hands, not just lines of code and quarterly earnings reports. The restaurant had seemed like the perfect investment. It sat in the heart of Beacon Hill, in a converted brownstone that had once housed a literary salon in the 19th century. The dining room featured exposed brick, crystal chandeliers that had been imported from Prague, and windows that overlooked the gold-domed State House. It was beautiful, prestigious, and according to every review, served some of the finest contemporary American cuisine in New England. But beauty, as Richard was learning, didn't always translate to profit. "I've asked Marcus for explanations," Richard said, referring to Marcus Whitmore, the restaurant's general manager. "He tells me it's normal operational fluctuations, rising labor costs, increased competition. But the numbers, Jameson, the numbers tell me someone is bleeding me dry." What I didn't know then, what none of us knew, was that Marcus Whitmore had turned the Meridian into his personal cash machine. But that revelation would come later in ways none of us could have anticipated. Richard spent the next week buried in spreadsheets, calling his accountants, even hiring a discreet consulting firm to review the books. They found nothing conclusive. Everything appeared legitimate on paper. The problem, if there was one, was hidden beneath layers of normal business operations. That's when Richard hatched his plan. "I'm going undercover," he announced one evening as I prepared his dinner. He said it as casually as if he'd declared he was going to the gym. I nearly dropped the wine bottle I was holding. "I beg your pardon, sir?" "Undercover," Like those television shows. I'll pose as a new hire, work in the restaurant for a few weeks, see what's really happening on the ground level. He smiled, pleased with himself. It's brilliant, isn't it? It's madness, I replied, forgetting my usual deference. Sir, with respect, you can't simply walk into your own restaurant and expect no one to recognize you. Why not? How many of the staff have actually met me? He had a point. Richard was an absent owner, preferring to let Marcus run the day-to-day operations while he focused on his investment portfolio and the tech startups he was beginning to fund. I'll tell Marcus I'm selling the place, that I'm stepping back from operations entirely. Meanwhile, I'll apply through normal channels, get hired, and observe. And what role would you play in this charade? I asked, already knowing I wouldn't be able to dissuade him. When Richard Sterling set his mind to something, the universe tended to rearrange itself to accommodate him. Waiter, he said simply. Front of house. That's where the money moves. That's where I'll see everything. What Richard didn't understand then, what his billions had insulated him from understanding, was that being a waiter wasn't just about carrying plates and taking orders. It was about navigating an entire social ecosystem where power dynamics shifted with every interaction, where dignity was earned in small moments of grace under pressure, and where people's true characters revealed themselves in how they treated those they considered beneath them. He was about to get an education that no MBA program could provide. The transformation took 3 days. Richard grew out his stubble into a neat beard. He bought glasses with plain lenses. He studied the mannerisms of service staff, practiced walking with a slight hesitation instead of his usual confident stride. He even changed his voice, adopting a slightly higher pitch and a hint of a working-class Boston accent. I helped him create a background. David Morgan, 35 years old, worked his way through various restaurants in the city, recently available after the closure of the establishment in Cambridge. He had references, all from restaurants that had actually closed, making verification difficult. On paper, he was exactly the kind of experienced hire that the Meridian would want. "How do I look?" Richard asked on the morning he planned to submit his application. He stood before me in khaki pants and a simple button-down shirt, his BMW keys replaced with a set for a 10-year-old Honda Civic he'd purchased for cash. Like a man about to discover something he's not prepared for, I said honestly. He laughed, thinking I was joking. "Jameson, I built a software empire from scratch. I've negotiated with Fortune 500 executives. I think I can handle waiting tables for a few weeks." I said nothing. Sometimes wisdom comes not from warnings given, but from lessons lived. Richard submitted his application on a Monday. By Wednesday, Marcus had called David Morgan in for an interview. By Friday, David Morgan was scheduled to start the following week. It was almost too easy, which should have been Richard's first warning sign. Marcus Whitmore was hiring people as fast as they walked through the door, and that kind of turnover always meant something was deeply wrong. The night before Richard's first shift, he came to me with an unusual request. "I need you to do something for me," he said. "If things go wrong, if my cover is blown, I need you to be ready to step in. But otherwise, no matter what you see, no matter what happens, don't interfere. I need to experience this authentically." "What exactly are you expecting to happen, sir?" He shrugged. "I don't know. That's the point. But Jameson, I have a feeling that whatever I'm about to discover, it's going to be important, more important than just catching whoever's stealing from me." He was right about that, though not in the way either of us imagined. The Meridian opened for dinner service at 5:30 in the evening. Richard arrived at 4, entering through the staff entrance in the alley behind the building. I watched from my car parked across the street, feeling absurdly like some sort of spy handler from a Cold War novel. The staff entrance led to a narrow hallway that opened into the kitchen on one side and the staff changing room on the other. Richard later described it to me. The flickering fluorescent lights, the scuffed linoleum floor, the bulletin board covered with schedule changes and health inspection notices. It smelled of bleach and old grease, a stark contrast to the lavender and rosemary scent that greeted guests in the main dining room. Marcus was waiting for him, clipboard in hand. Marcus Whitmore was 42, handsome in a sharp-featured way, with salt and pepper hair styled precisely and suits that cost more than most of his staff made in a month. He smiled when he saw Richard, but it was the smile of a shark, all teeth and calculation. "David Morgan," Marcus said, extending his hand. "Welcome to the Meridian. Let's get you set up." Richard shook his hand, and later he would tell me that in that moment he felt the first flutter of genuine nervousness. This wasn't a boardroom where his reputation preceded him. This was Marcus's kingdom, and David Morgan was just another subject, disposable and replaceable. The training was minimal. Marcus handed Richard off to another waiter, a young man named Kevin, who spoke in rapid-fire sentences and seemed to be in a constant state of barely controlled stress. "Okay, so basically, the computer system is from like the Stone Age. You punch in table numbers here. Don't ever punch the wrong table number because Marcus will lose his mind. Sections rotate, but sometimes they don't. And you just have to figure it out. Tips are pooled except when they're not. And whatever you do, don't ever question Marcus in front of customers. Got it?" Richard did not, in fact, got it, but he nodded anyway. "Where's the employee handbook?" he asked. Kevin laughed. "Employee handbook, that's funny. Listen, you seem like a nice guy, so I'm going to give you the real handbook. Rule 1, Marcus is always right. Rule 2, if Marcus is wrong, refer to Rule 1. Rule 3, keep your head down, do your work, and don't get attached to anyone because the turnover here is insane." "Why is the turnover so high?" Richard asked. Kevin's expression shifted, becoming guarded. "You'll figure it out. Hey, let's get you a uniform." The uniform consisted of black slacks, a white dress shirt, a black vest, and a simple black tie. Richard changed in the cramped staff bathroom, staring at himself in the spotted mirror. The man looking back at him was unfamiliar. Not Richard Sterling, technology entrepreneur and millionaire. Just David Morgan, waiter, one of dozens who would pass through the Meridian's doors over the coming months. He took a deep breath and pushed open the bathroom door. The pre-service staff meeting happened at 4:30. The entire front-of-house team gathered in a corner of the dining room while the kitchen staff continued their preparations. There were perhaps 15 people, waiters, bussers, a hostess, a bartender, and a sommelier. Marcus stood before them like a general addressing troops. "Good evening, team," Marcus began, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who'd given this speech 1,000 times. "We have a full book tonight. Senator Williams is dining with his family at 7, so I expect perfect service at table 12. The Caldwell party has specifically requested Eliza as their server." Richard noticed several people glance toward a young woman standing at the back of the group. She was petite, with dark hair pulled into a neat bun, and she wore her uniform with a kind of quiet dignity that immediately set her apart. She didn't react to Marcus's mention of her name, but Richard saw something flicker in her eyes, not pleasure at being requested, but something else. Resignation, perhaps. "David," Marcus called out, and Richard nearly forgot to respond. "You'll be shadowing tonight. Stay close to Eliza. Watch how she works. She's one of our best." The way Marcus said best made Richard's skin crawl, though he couldn't have explained why. After the meeting, as the staff dispersed to their stations, Richard approached the young woman Marcus had called Eliza. "Hi," he said, extending his hand. "I'm David. I guess I'm your shadow tonight." She looked at him with eyes that were a striking amber color, almost gold in the dining room's warm lighting. When she shook his hand, her grip was firm, professional. "Eliza Chen," she said. "Welcome to the Meridian. Have you worked in fine dining before?" "A bit," Richard lied. "Different cities, different places." She nodded, already moving toward the service station. "Stay close, watch everything, and if I tell you to do something, do it immediately without questions. Service moves fast here, and hesitation can throw off the entire flow." "Understood. Also," she paused, turning back to him, "a piece of advice. When Marcus gives you feedback, just nod and say thank you. Don't explain, don't defend, don't try to clarify. It only makes things worse." "Worse how?" But she'd already moved away, checking the settings at her assigned tables with practiced efficiency. Richard would learn the answer to his questions soon enough. The dining room of the Meridian was beautiful in that calculated way that expensive restaurants achieved. The lighting was low and warm, casting everything in a golden glow. Fresh flowers adorned each table, their scent mixing with the aroma of garlic and butter wafting from the kitchen. Classical music played softly through hidden speakers, just loud enough to create ambiance without impeding conversation. As a diner, Richard had appreciated these details abstractly. As David Morgan, waiter, he saw them differently. He saw the fingerprints that needed to be polished away from wine glasses. He noticed the careful spacing of tables, calculated to maximize covers while maintaining the illusion of intimacy. He observed how the entire room was positioned to draw the eye toward the open kitchen, where chefs in white coats moved like dancers in a carefully choreographed performance. But more than anything, he noticed the people, not the diners, though they demanded attention with their requests and complaints and expectations. No, he noticed the staff, how they moved around each other with an intimacy born of shared stress. How they communicated in glances and subtle gestures. How their entire demeanor shifted when Marcus entered the room, back straightening, smiles becoming just a fraction more fixed. The evening began smoothly. Richard followed Eliza from table to table, watching as she greeted guests with genuine warmth, remembered their preferences, suggested wine pairings with quiet confidence. She was exceptional at her job, he realized. Not just competent, but truly gifted with an intuitive sense of what each table needed. Some wanted conversation and engagement, others preferred to be invisible, attended to without intrusion. Eliza read them all perfectly. "Where did you learn to do this?" Richard asked during a brief lull. "My parents owned a restaurant," she said, inputting an order into the ancient computer system Kevin had mentioned. "I grew up in dining rooms. You?" "Learned on the job, mostly." She glanced at him, and for a moment he thought she saw through his disguise, but she just smiled slightly. "Well, you have good instincts. You haven't gotten in my way once, which is more than I can say for most shadows." It was such a small compliment, delivered so casually, but Richard felt absurdly pleased by it. When was the last time someone had praised him for something as simple as not being in the way? At 7:15, Senator Williams arrived with his family. Marcus materialized instantly, all obsequious charm, personally escorting them to table 12. Richard noticed how the senator's wife looked around the dining room with the casual entitlement of someone who expected excellence and would notice nothing unless something went wrong. The Caldwell party arrived shortly after. A group of 8 well-dressed people in their 50s and 60s. They greeted Eliza like an old friend, and Richard watched as she transformed, becoming more animated, laughing at their jokes, making recommendations with the confidence of someone who knew their tastes intimately. "They come here twice a month," she told Richard as they walked back to the service station. "Mr. Caldwell made his fortune in commercial real estate. They're kind, generous tippers, and they treat service staff like human beings. In this business, that makes them unicorns." "And the others?" Richard asked. "The others are why the turnover is so high." As if summoned by her words, disaster struck at table 7. It started with a simple mistake. A busser, a kid who couldn't have been more than 19, was clearing the appetizer course when he accidentally bumped a wine glass with his tray. The glass tipped, spilling red wine across the white tablecloth and onto the lap of a woman in a dress that probably cost more than the busser made in 6 months. The woman shrieked. Her companion, a man in an expensive suit, shot to his feet, his face flushing red. "You incompetent idiot!" the man shouted, his voice cutting through the refined murmur of the dining room. "Do you have any idea how much this dress costs?" The busser stammered an apology, his face going pale. Richard saw Marcus cutting across the dining room like a missile locked on target. "Sir, ma'am, I am so terribly sorry," Marcus began. his voice dripping with concern. But he wasn't looking at the guests. He was looking at the busser with an expression of such cold fury that Richard felt his own stomach clench. "We will of course cover any cleaning costs," Marcus continued smoothly. "Your entire meal tonight will be complimentary, and I will personally ensure this employee is dealt with appropriately." The way he said "dealt with" made it sound like a mob hit. The guests accepted the apology, mollified by the promise of a free meal. Marcus smiled, assured them once more, and then turned to the busser. "You, staff room, now." Richard watched the kid walk away, shoulders hunched, and something in him reacted instinctively. He started to follow, but Eliza grabbed his arm. "Don't," she said quietly. "But I know what you're thinking. Don't. You can't help him, and you'll only make it worse for yourself. What's going to happen to him?" Eliza's expression was carefully neutral, but Richard saw the anger simmering beneath. Marcus will humiliate him, probably fire him, definitely make sure he understands that he's worthless and lucky to have ever had a job here in the first place. Then he'll dock the cost of the meal from the kid's last paycheck, even though that's illegal, and the kid will take it because he needs the reference and can't afford a lawyer. Richard stared at her. "That's insane. It was an accident. Accidents happen. Not in Marcus's world," Eliza said. "In Marcus's world, we're all replaceable, and fear is the only thing that keeps us in line." She walked away to check on the Caldwell table, leaving Richard standing alone, processing what he'd just witnessed. This wasn't just about embezzlement or financial irregularities. This was about something darker, a culture of cruelty masquerading as high standards. And Richard had built this, not intentionally, but through his absence, through his willingness to let Marcus run things as he saw fit, as long as the restaurant maintained its reputation. He'd been so focused on the prestige of owning the Meridian that he'd never stopped to consider what ownership actually meant, what responsibility actually looked like. The busser didn't return that night. Kevin told Richard later that Marcus had fired him on the spot, without severance, without reference, without even letting him collect his full tips from the previous week. "It's how it works here," Kevin said with a shrug that tried to be casual but didn't quite succeed. "Marcus needs us scared. Scared people don't ask questions, they don't complain, they definitely don't unionize or go to the labor board. But what he's doing is illegal." Kevin laughed, a bitter sound. "You're new, so I'll explain this once. Marcus has connections, real connections. His brother-in-law is some big-shot lawyer. His college roommate works in the state labor office, and even if we wanted to fight him, who's going to believe waiters over a respected restaurant manager? Who's going to care?" Richard wanted to say, "I care. I'm the owner, and I care." But David Morgan had no such power. David Morgan was just another waiter who needed to keep his head down and his mouth shut if he wanted to keep his job. It was a humbling realization, and it was only the beginning. The rest of the evening passed without incident, though Richard noticed new details he'd missed before, how Marcus circulated through the dining room with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, how the staff's shoulders would tense when he approached, how conversations would stop mid-sentence, only resuming when he'd moved on. He also noticed Eliza, really noticed her, not just her technical skill, though that was impressive, but the small acts of kindness she showed to the other staff members. How she covered for a server who was falling behind, how she split her tips evenly, even when she'd clearly earned more. How she thanked the kitchen staff by name when picking up orders, treating them with a respect that Richard suspected was rare in this environment. At one point, Richard saw her slip a roll and some butter into her bag when she thought no one was looking. He almost said something, then stopped himself. She probably hadn't eaten today. Fine dining restaurants had notoriously bad policies about staff meals, and Richard knew that Marcus was exactly the type to forbid employees from eating the same food they served to guests. The evening finally ended at 11. The last guests departed, the dining room was cleaned and reset for the next day, and the staff gathered to count tips. The process was surprisingly complex, with various percentages going to different positions, all carefully calculated and recorded. Marcus stood over the process like a prison warden, his eyes tracking every dollar that changed hands. "Acceptable night," he announced when the counting was complete. "Eliza, as usual, your section outperformed. The Caldwell party left their standard generous tip, I see." "Yes, sir," Eliza said quietly. "It's a shame they requested you specifically. It creates an unfair advantage in the tip pool. Perhaps I should start rotating their table regardless of their requests." Richard saw Eliza's jaw tighten, but her voice remained even. "Of course, sir. Whatever you think is best." Marcus smiled. "I'm glad you understand. Teamwork is so important, don't you think?" It was a power play, pure and simple, punishing Eliza for being good at her job by threatening to take away her most reliable table. Richard wanted to intervene, to say something, but he remembered his promise to himself. Observe, don't interfere. Learn what was really happening. But God, it was harder than he'd expected. After Marcus left, the tension in the room eased fractionally. Staff members who'd been silent began to talk in low voices. Someone made a joke. Someone else laughed, the sound strange and slightly desperate in the aftermath of Marcus's presence. Eliza approached Richard as he was changing back into his street clothes. "You did well tonight," she said. "Most new people are disasters on their first shift, but you kept up. Marcus will probably put you on the schedule starting next week." "Is that good or bad?" Richard asked. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yes," he laughed despite himself. "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have." She grabbed her coat from her locker. "A word of advice, David. Don't get attached to this place. Don't start thinking you can change things or make them better. Just do your job, collect your paycheck, and get out as soon as you find something better. The people who stay too long here..." She trailed off, then shook her head. "Just don't stay too long." "How long have you been here?" Richard asked. "Too long," she said softly. Then she was gone, leaving Richard alone in the shabby staff room, surrounded by the lingering smell of cleaning supplies and crushed dreams. I picked him up at 11:30, parking in the same spot across from the staff entrance. Richard collapsed into the passenger seat with a heavy sigh. "Well?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the Boston streets sliding past the windows. Finally, he spoke. "Jameson, I've made a terrible mistake. Not tonight. 3 years ago, when I bought the Meridian and then did nothing but sign checks and show up for ribbon cuttings. I created this. I'm responsible for this." "What did you see?" "Everything," he said, "and nothing I was prepared for." He told me about the fired busser, about Marcus's systematic intimidation, about the way the staff lived in a constant state of fear disguised as professionalism. But he also told me about Eliza, though he didn't realize yet how much he revealed in the way he talked about her. "She's remarkable," he said. "The way she moves through that dining room, it's like watching an artist work. But more than that, she's kind in a place that punishes kindness. She's strong where she has every excuse to be broken, and she's alone. I could see it. Everyone there is alone, isolated from each other because Marcus has made sure that solidarity is too dangerous." "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I'm going back," he said immediately. "I'm going to work every shift they'll give me. I'm going to document everything, and when I have enough evidence, I'm going to burn Marcus's little kingdom to the ground." "And the girl? Eliza?" Richard was quiet again. Then softly, "I don't know yet, but Jameson, when she looked at me tonight, when she said I did well, I felt something I haven't felt in years. I felt seen, not as Richard Sterling, billionaire, not as a conquest or a connection or a source of investment capital, just as David, a person, an equal. That's dangerous," I observed. "I know," he said, "but I think maybe dangerous is exactly what I need right now." He had no idea how right he was, or how much danger was actually coming. The next few days followed a pattern. Richard would show up for his shifts as David Morgan, work alongside the staff, and carefully document everything he observed. He'd come home exhausted, his feet aching, his back sore from hours of standing and carrying heavy trays. He'd never realized how physically demanding service work was. But the physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the emotional toll of watching Marcus operate. Every shift brought new examples of casual cruelty. A server reduced to tears for forgetting to mention the evening special to a table. A kitchen porter threatened with deportation because Marcus suspected he'd eaten a piece of bread. A bartender docked an entire night's tips because a guest complained the martini wasn't cold enough. And through it all, Marcus maintained his veneer of professional courtesy, smiling at guests, glad-handing the regulars, acting like everyone's best friend. It was a masterclass in two-faced manipulation, and Richard found himself studying Marcus with horrified fascination. How did someone become this? Was it the power that corrupted, or had Marcus always been this way, simply waiting for an opportunity to let his true nature show? But if Marcus was the darkness at the heart of the Meridian, Eliza was its light. Richard found himself watching her more than he probably should have. Not in a creepy way, he told himself, but with genuine admiration. She had a gift for making people feel valued. Guests left her tables happier than they arrived. Difficult customers became pleasant under her care. Even the kitchen staff, normally hostile toward front-of-house workers, treated her with respect. "How do you do it?" Richard asked her one night as they were setting up for service. "How do you stay so positive in this place?" Eliza paused in polishing a wine glass, the light catching the crystal and throwing rainbow patterns on the white tablecloth. "I don't think of it as staying positive," she said carefully. "I think of it as not letting this place take away who I am. Marcus controls a lot, but he doesn't control that, not unless I let him. But doesn't it eat at you, the way he treats people? Every single day," she said quietly. "But here's what I learned. If I let his cruelty make me cruel, if I let his anger make me angry, then he wins. He wins by turning me into him. So instead, I choose differently. I choose to be kind even when it's not rewarded. I choose to care even when it's not appreciated. Not for him, for me." Richard stared at her, and something shifted in his chest. This woman, who made in a week what he spent on wine at dinner, who had every reason to be bitter and broken, was teaching him about integrity, about choosing who you were, regardless of circumstances. "You're wasted here," he said without thinking. She laughed, a genuine sound that lit up her face. "Thanks, I think. But we all have our reasons for staying in situations that aren't good for us. Money, fear, inertia, or sometimes just the stubborn belief that if we stick it out long enough, things will get better. And do you believe things will get better here?" Her smile faded. "No, but I believe I'll get better, stronger, more prepared for whatever comes next. That's enough for now." She moved away to greet arriving guests, leaving Richard standing alone, mind racing. This woman deserved so much more than the Meridian could offer her. More than Marcus's petty tyranny and stolen tips and the constant stress of service. She deserved to be seen for what she was, exceptional. But David Morgan couldn't tell her that. David Morgan was just another waiter, no different from her, no more able to change her circumstances than his own. For the first time in his life, Richard Sterling felt the frustration of being powerless. It was March 21st when everything started to unravel. Richard had been working at the Meridian for 2 weeks, and he'd accumulated a damning pile of evidence against Marcus. Falsified invoices from suppliers that didn't exist. A second set of books that showed Marcus skimming thousands of dollars weekly, records of illegal tip-pooling policies, evidence of wage theft. It was enough to fire Marcus, possibly enough to press criminal charges, but Richard wanted more. He wanted to understand the full scope of the corruption. How deep did it go? Was Marcus working alone, or were others involved? That night, the dining room was particularly busy. A private party of 20 occupied the back room, while the main dining room was filled with the usual mix of business dinners and anniversary celebrations. The kitchen was slammed and stress levels were high. Richard was working alongside Eliza in adjacent sections. They'd developed an easy rapport, covering for each other smoothly, communicating in the shorthand that good service teams develop. He found himself looking forward to their brief interactions, the moments when her guard dropped and she let him see glimpses of her real personality. She was funny, wickedly observant, and possessed a quiet strength that Richard found himself drawn to in ways that had nothing to do with professional respect. He was in trouble, and he knew it. David Morgan was falling for Eliza Chen, which would have been complicated enough. But Richard Sterling falling for her, that was a disaster waiting to happen. Around 8:30, Marcus approached Eliza's section with a couple Richard hadn't seen before. The man was in his 60s, corpulent and red-faced. The woman with him was perhaps 30, dressed in a way that screamed expensive, but not tasteful. Marcus was practically bowing as he led them to Eliza's best table. "Richard Sterling has been a friend of the Meridian for years," Marcus was saying loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "You'll love the duck. Absolutely spectacular." Richard froze. They were talking about him, using his real name. The couple must be friends of his from his actual life, people who knew Richard Sterling but not David Morgan. He turned away quickly, but not before the man glanced in his direction. Did recognition flicker in his eyes? Richard couldn't tell. He kept his head down, busied himself with clearing a nearby table, tried to make himself invisible. But invisibility, he'd learned, wasn't always possible. "David," Marcus called out, "come here, please." Richard's heart hammered as he approached. Marcus's smile was sharp. "Mr. Hendricks here would like a recommendation on our wine selection," Marcus said smoothly. "Since you're so knowledgeable about our cellar, perhaps you could assist." It was a test. Marcus's eyes glittered with something Richard couldn't quite read. Suspicion. Amusement. The man at the table, Hendricks, looked at Richard with vague interest. Richard kept his voice steady, pitched slightly higher than normal. "Of course, sir. We have an excellent selection. What kind of flavors does the gentleman prefer?" He went through the motions, recommending a Bordeaux that he knew Hendricks would appreciate because Richard had actually had dinner with the man 6 months ago and remembered his preferences. But he recommended it as David would, hesitantly, as if reading from memorized notes rather than speaking from personal knowledge. Hendricks ordered the wine without a second glance at Richard. The moment passed. Marcus moved on. Richard exhaled slowly, his heart still racing. That had been close, too close. But the near miss sharpened something in Richard. He'd been playing it safe, observing from the sidelines. But observation wasn't enough anymore. He needed to act. More importantly, he was starting to realize that this whole exercise had stopped being about catching Marcus and started being about something else entirely. Something that had to do with Eliza's quiet dignity and the way the kitchen staff flinched when Marcus walked by and the resigned exhaustion in Kevin's eyes. It had become personal. Later that night, during a rare, quiet moment, Richard found himself standing at the service station next to Eliza. She was rolling silverware, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Can I ask you something?" Richard said. "Sure." "Why do you stay? You're clearly talented enough to work anywhere. So why here, with Marcus treating everyone like dirt?" Eliza's hands stilled. For a moment, Richard thought she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke, her voice so quiet he had to lean in to hear her. "I'm saving money," she said. "I'm in a culinary program, community college, at night. I work here because the tips are good when Marcus doesn't steal them, and because I'm learning from the kitchen staff. The chef here, Antoine, he's teaching me things they don't teach in school. How to really taste food, how to balance flavors, how to cook with intention instead of just following recipes." "You want to be a chef?" She smiled, and for the first time since Richard had met her, it was a smile of pure, unguarded joy. "I want to have my own place someday. Small. Maybe just a food truck to start, but mine, where I can cook food that means something, food that nourishes people, not just impresses them." "That's beautiful," Richard said, and meant it. "It's a dream," she corrected. "Dreams are easy. Making them real is the hard part. That takes money, time, courage, and right now I have exactly one of those 3 things." "Which one?" "Courage. But courage without resources is just stubbornness wearing a fancy hat." Richard laughed, genuinely delighted. That's a great line. My grandmother used to say it. She was stubborn as hell and proud of it. Eliza finished the last set of silverware and looked at him directly. What about you, David? What are you saving for? What's your dream? The question caught Richard off guard. When was the last time anyone had asked him about his dreams? People asked Richard Sterling about his goals, his projections, his next acquisition. But dreams were for people who still believed in possibility. I don't know, he said honestly. I thought I did, but lately I'm realizing I've been so busy chasing what I thought I should want that I never stopped to figure out what I actually want. Eliza studied him with those amber eyes that seemed to see more than they should. You're not like the other waiters here. Richard's pulse spiked. What do you mean? I mean you're too old to be doing this as a stepping stone, but you don't have the burned-out look of someone who's been in service their whole life. You're here for a reason, but I don't think it's the reason you'd tell people if they asked. Maybe I'm just between things, Richard said carefully. Maybe, Eliza agreed, but a tone suggested she didn't believe him. Or maybe you're running from something, or towards something. Either way, David Morgan, you're a mystery. Is that a bad thing? She smiled again, softer this time. No, I like mysteries. They're more interesting than people who have themselves all figured out. Marcus's voice cut through the moment like a knife. Eliza! Table 9 needs their check. Now, please. The warmth vanished from Eliza's expression, replaced by professional neutrality. She moved away without another word, and Richard was left standing alone, his mind spinning. She suspected something. Not the truth, perhaps, but enough to be dangerous. He should be worried about his cover. Instead, all he could think about was the way she'd smiled when talking about her dream, and how much he wanted to help make that dream real. The following week brought a shift in the restaurant's dynamics. Marcus announced that he was implementing a new scheduling system, one that would rotate servers through different sections and different shifts unpredictably. It's about fairness, Marcus explained during the staff meeting, making sure everyone has equal opportunity. But the staff knew better. It was about control, about making sure no one could develop relationships with regular customers, about keeping everyone off balance and easier to manipulate. The new system hit Eliza hardest. Her regular tables, the Caldwells and others who specifically requested her, were now being randomly assigned to other servers. Richard watched her take the news with her usual quiet composure, but he saw the tightness around her eyes, the way her jaw clenched. After the meeting, Richard found her in the alley behind the restaurant, taking deep breaths of the cold March air. I'm sorry, he said. She shook her head. Don't be. This is Marcus being Marcus. He saw that I had something good, so he took it away. It's what he does. But why? What does he gain from making you miserable? Power, Eliza said simply. That's all Marcus cares about, having power over people, making sure we all know that we exist at his pleasure, that he can take away anything good in our lives whenever he wants. She turned to look at Richard. You'll figure it out eventually. Everyone does. The question is what you'll do when you figure it out. Most people do nothing, because doing nothing is safer than doing something and losing everything. What if someone did do something? Richard asked carefully. Well, what if someone stood up to him? Eliza laughed, but there was no humor in it. Then that someone would be fired. Or worse. Marcus has connections, David. Real connections. His brother-in-law is a lawyer who specializes in making problems disappear. His college friend works in the state labor office. He's untouchable, but he wasn't. Richard knew he wasn't, because Richard Sterling owned the Meridian, and no amount of connections could protect Marcus from that reality. Still, Richard said nothing, because David Morgan had no such power, and breaking his cover now would mean losing any chance of truly understanding what was happening here. More selfishly, it would mean losing whatever fragile connection he'd built with Eliza, and he wasn't ready for that yet. He was playing a dangerous game, and he knew it. Every day he spent as David Morgan, every conversation he had with Eliza, every moment of genuine connection they shared, he was digging himself deeper into a hole that would be impossible to climb out of when the truth finally came to light. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. The night everything changed started like any other. It was a Thursday in early April, and a spring storm was rolling into Boston, the kind that arrived with dark clouds and thunder that rattled windows. The dining room had several cancellations due to the weather, which meant a lighter load, but also lower tips. Marcus was in a foul mood. A foul mood for Marcus meant active cruelty rather than his usual passive intimidation. He'd already berated 2 servers for minor infractions, docked someone's pay for breaking a water glass, and told the hostess she was getting fat and should consider whether she really wanted to keep working somewhere that required her to maintain a certain appearance. The staff moved through their duties with the hypervigilance of people walking through a minefield. Richard was working the bar section that night, while Eliza had been assigned to the back room where a small private party was dining. They'd barely seen each other all evening, which was probably Marcus's intention. He'd noticed their easy rapport and had started scheduling them apart. Around 9 o'clock, Richard heard raised voices from the back room. He moved closer, concerned, and saw Marcus standing over Eliza, his face flushed red with anger. "I specifically told you the Williams party wanted their entrees coursed," Marcus was saying, his voice low and dangerous. "Not brought out all at once. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is?" "Sir, I checked the reservation notes 3 times, Eliza said, her voice steady despite the humiliation of being dressed down in front of guests. "There was nothing about coursing, and when I asked you directly before service, you said to bring everything together because they were on a tight schedule. Are you calling me a liar?" Marcus's voice dropped even lower, which somehow made it more menacing. "No, sir. I'm just trying to understand what went wrong so I can fix it. What went wrong is that you're incompetent. What went wrong is that I trusted you with an important table and you made me look like a fool." He paused, then delivered his coup de grace. "Clean out your locker. You're done here." The dining room had gone quiet. Every staff member, every guest who could hear, was frozen in place. Eliza stood very still. Richard could see her processing, could see the moment when she decided not to fight, not to beg, not to give Marcus the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Understood," she said quietly. Then she turned and walked toward the staff room, her head held high, her steps steady. Richard didn't think. He just moved, following her, some part of him screaming that he couldn't let this happen, that he had to do something. He found her in the staff room, standing in front of her locker, staring at it without opening it. "Eliza, don't," she said, her voice tight. "Please don't say anything kind right now. I'm holding it together, but if you're nice to me, I'll fall apart, and I can't fall apart here. I won't give him that." Richard stopped maintaining his distance. "This is wrong. What he did is illegal. You could fight this." "With what?" She finally opened her locker, began removing her personal items. "With the money I don't have for a lawyer? Against the connections I don't have? Marcus was right about one thing. He's made me look like a fool. A fool for staying here as long as I did. A fool for believing that if I just worked hard enough, if I was just good enough, things would somehow get better." "You're not a fool," Richard said fiercely. "You're the best person in this entire place. You have more integrity in your little finger than Marcus has in his entire body." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Richard saw tears gathering in her eyes that she refused to let fall. "You know what the worst part is," she said. "I believed in work. I believed that hard work and decency and treating people with respect mattered. But they don't, do they? Not really. Money matters. Power matters. Character? Character is just what people pretend to care about when it doesn't cost them anything." And there it was. The moment Richard had been unconsciously waiting for. The moment when Eliza Chen, who'd maintained her grace and kindness through Marcus's endless cruelty, finally reached her breaking point and articulated the philosophy that Richard Sterling had built his life around without ever admitting it. He opened his mouth to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that character did matter. But before he could speak, she continued. "No," she said, more to herself than to him. "That's not true. I don't believe that. I won't believe that. Money doesn't buy character, David. Character is everything. It's the only thing we really own, the only thing no one can take away from us. Marcus can fire me, but he can't make me like him. He can take my job, but he can't take my integrity. 3 words in the middle of that declaration. Character is everything. They hit Richard like a physical blow, because he'd spent his entire life believing the opposite. He'd believed that success was everything, that winning was everything, that accumulating wealth and power and influence was everything. He'd told himself that character was a luxury for people who couldn't afford to make hard decisions. But standing in that shabby staff room, watching this woman who just lost her livelihood, refused to lose herself, Richard understood with sudden, painful clarity that he'd been wrong about everything that mattered. Character wasn't a luxury. It was the foundation, and he'd built his empire on sand. "Eliza," he said, his voice rough, "you're right. Character is everything, and you have more of it than anyone I've ever met." She smiled, sad and small. "Thanks, David. That's kind of you to say." "I mean it. I know you do." She finished packing her bag. "I'm going to miss you, mystery man. You were one of the good ones." She started to walk past him, and Richard knew he was at a crossroads. He could let her walk away, maintain his cover, complete his investigation, and then fire Marcus and clean up the Meridian from his position of power. It was the logical choice, the strategic choice. Or he could stop her, tell her the truth, blow his cover, and risk everything he'd been working toward. He reached out and caught her arm. "Wait, David, I really need to go before I completely lose it." "My name isn't David." She froze, turned to look at him, confusion clouding her features. "What?" "My name isn't David Morgan. It's Richard Sterling. I own the Meridian. I've been working here undercover to figure out why the restaurant was losing money. I found out it was Marcus. He's been embezzling, and I have enough evidence to bury him. I was going to fire him tomorrow, but then this happened, and He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly aware of how insane this all sounded. "I couldn't let you walk out of here thinking that character doesn't matter, because it does. You've proven that every single day, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't step in sooner. I'm sorry I lied to you." Eliza stared at him for a long moment. Her expression went through several rapid changes: confusion, disbelief, recognition, and then something that looked like betrayal. "You're Richard Sterling," she repeated flatly. "Yes, the billionaire tech entrepreneur who bought this place 3 years ago. Yes. So this whole time, every conversation we've had, every moment we've shared, you've been lying to me. It wasn't like that. What was it like then?" Her voice was rising now, anger finally breaking through her control. "Were you studying me? Was I some kind of experiment? Let's see how the poor waitress behaves when she thinks I'm one of her people." "No, Eliza, no. I came here to investigate Marcus, yes. But getting to know you, that was real. That was based on a lie." She stepped back from him, and the physical distance felt like a chasm. "Every word you said to me, you said knowing that you had power over my life that I didn't even know about. Do you understand how that feels? You knew my dreams, my fears, my struggles, and the whole time you could have fixed everything with a snap of your fingers, but you didn't because you were too busy playing dress-up. That's not fair." "Fair?" Eliza laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "You want to talk about fair? How about this? You lied to me about your identity for weeks. You watched Marcus abuse and humiliate people, including me, and did nothing because you wanted to gather evidence. You let me get fired tonight because maintaining your cover was more important than protecting someone you claimed to care about. Does that sound fair to you, Mr. Sterling?" Each word was a knife, and Richard accepted every cut because he deserved them. She was right, about all of it. "You're right," he said quietly. "Everything you said is right. I was a coward. I told myself I was being strategic, but really I was just afraid. Afraid of taking responsibility. Afraid of making real decisions instead of hiding behind spreadsheets and quarterly reports. I let my absence create the space for Marcus to build his little kingdom of cruelty. And then, when I finally bothered to pay attention, I did it in the most cowardly way possible. I don't want your confession, Eliza said, her voice breaking. I want to unknow you. I want to go back to an hour ago when David Morgan was just a nice guy who understood what it was like to work for a living. But I can't, because David Morgan never existed. There was only ever you, Richard Sterling, billionaire, playing pretend in my life. She picked up her bag and walked to the door. Then she paused, not turning around. For what it's worth, I hope you fire Marcus. I hope you fix this place. I hope all those people in there get the fair treatment they deserve. But I also hope you understand that you can't fix this. She gestured between them. You can't buy back trust. Money doesn't work that way. What if I could earn it back? Richard asked desperately. What if I proved that I've changed, that knowing you changed me? Now she did turn, and her eyes were dry but devastated. Then you'd still be you. A man who thinks everything is transactional, that trust is something to be earned like a promotion, that people are problems to be solved with the right approach. Character is everything, Richard, and you just showed me yours. She walked out, just walked out of the Meridian, out of Richard's life, and took something vital with her that he hadn't even known he possessed until it was gone. Richard stood alone in the staff room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of industrial cleaner sharp in his nose. He'd never felt more hollow. I was waiting in the car when he emerged 20 minutes later. One look at his face told me everything I needed to know. The plan fell apart, he said as he collapsed into the passenger seat. What happened? He told me, all of it. The firing, the revelation, Eliza's words. When he finished, he looked at me with eyes that seemed years older than they had that morning. She's right, Jameson, about everything. I'm a coward who hides behind money and strategy instead of actually engaging with the world. I watched that place destroy people because I was too busy protecting my investment to protect the actual human beings involved. And then, when I finally tried to do something, I did it in the most self-serving way possible. What will you do now? I asked. What I should have done 3 years ago. I'm going to own my responsibilities. Fire Marcus, clean house, rebuild the culture from the ground up. But Jameson, his voice cracked, she'll never forgive me. I saw it in her eyes. I had something real with her, maybe the only real thing I've had in years, and I destroyed it. Then you'll have to prove her wrong, I said simply. Not about forgiving you, about who you are. You'll have to actually become the man she thought David Morgan was. Richard was quiet for a long time. Then, I don't know if I can. You can. The question is whether you will. That night, Richard didn't sleep. He sat at his desk with the evidence he'd accumulated against Marcus spread before him, and he drafted a plan. Not a business plan, a human plan. A plan for how to actually fix the Meridian in a way that mattered. The next morning, he walked through the front door of the Meridian at 10 a.m., not as David Morgan, but as Richard Sterling. Marcus was in his office, going through reservation books. He looked up when Richard entered, and the blood drained from his face. Mr. Sterling, this is unexpected. We weren't expecting an owner's visit. You're fired, Richard said simply. Effective immediately. Security is outside, waiting to escort you from the building. You have 10 minutes to gather your personal effects. Anything else becomes property of the Meridian as partial restitution for the money you've stolen. Marcus's shock lasted approximately 5 seconds before his lawyer instincts kicked in. You can't prove anything. And if you try to take action against me, I'll bury you in litigation. My brother-in-law is a lawyer specializing in employment law who's going to have a very hard time defending you when I turn over my evidence to the district attorney. Which I'm doing this afternoon, by the way. Richard placed a thick folder on the desk. Embezzlement, wage theft, fraud, harassment. I have documentation of everything, Marcus. Every fake supplier invoice, every illegally withheld tip, every threat you made to vulnerable employees. Marcus's face went from white to red. You? You gathered this evidence? How? By doing something I should have done years ago, paying attention to what was happening in my own restaurant. Richard leaned forward. You're done, Marcus. In this city, in this industry, you're done. Now get out of my restaurant. For a moment, Marcus looked like he might argue. Then he seemed to deflate, reaching for his jacket with shaking hands. As security escorted him out, he turned back once. "That waitress," he said, "Eliza Chen. She was nothing special, you know. Just another worker bee. They're all replaceable." "No," Richard said quietly. "She wasn't. And that's something you'll never understand." After Marcus was gone, Richard called an emergency staff meeting. The entire team gathered in the dining room, nervous and confused. They'd seen Marcus escorted out. Rumors were flying. Richard stood before them, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be truly accountable. "My name is Richard Sterling. I own the Meridian. Most of you have never met me because I've been an absent owner, and that was my first mistake. My second mistake was hiring Marcus Whitmore and then failing to supervise him adequately. My third mistake was allowing a culture of fear and intimidation to flourish here because I cared more about profits than people." He paused, looking at each face. Some were openly hostile, others were simply scared. "I can't undo the past, but I can change the future. Effective immediately, Marcus is gone. I'm bringing in a new management team, and they will be chosen with input from all of you. We're implementing new policies, fair tip pooling, transparent scheduling, a proper grievance process, and participation in restaurant profits for everyone who works here. This is going to be a place where people are treated with dignity and respect, or it's not going to exist at all." Kevin, the waiter who'd trained Richard on his first night, raised his hand hesitantly. "Why should we believe you? You're rich. You can say anything. Tomorrow you could change your mind." "You're right. Words are cheap. So I'm putting it in writing. Contracts for everyone. Real contracts with real protections. And I'm establishing an independent oversight board that includes staff representation. You'll have actual power here, not just promises." Another hand went up. "What about Eliza? Marcus fired her last night. Is she getting her job back?" Richard's chest tightened. "I've tried to reach Eliza to offer her not just her job back, but a position as assistant manager with full benefits and a significant raise. She's not answering my calls. If anyone knows how to contact her, please tell her. Tell her I'm sorry, and tell her she was right about everything." The meeting continued for another hour. There were questions, concerns, skepticism. Richard answered everything as honestly as he could, knowing that trust wouldn't be rebuilt in a day or even a month. It would take time, consistency, and real change, but he was committed, because Eliza had been right. Character was everything. And if he wanted to live with himself, he had to become someone worthy of the space he occupied in the world. Over the next few weeks, Richard transformed the Meridian. He brought in new management, people who understood that hospitality meant hospitality to everyone, not just guests. He raised wages across the board. He implemented the policies he'd promised. He spent time in the restaurant every single day, not as an owner inspecting his investment, but as someone who was genuinely interested in the people who made the place work. The old guard left, unable or unwilling to adapt to the new culture. But new people came, drawn by word of mouth about a restaurant that actually treated its workers like human beings. Morale improved. Service improved. Ironically, profits improved too. But none of it felt like victory to Richard. Because every night he went home to his empty mansion and thought about Eliza, about her amber eyes and her quiet strength and the way she'd refused to let cruelty make her cruel. He'd tried to contact her dozens of times. Letters went unreturned. Calls went to voicemail. He'd driven by her apartment, but the landlord said she'd moved out weeks ago. She'd vanished from his life as completely as if she'd never existed. Except she had existed, and she'd changed everything. 3 months after that night, I was the one who finally found her. I'd been making discreet inquiries, using connections that Richard didn't have, and I finally got a lead. Eliza Chen was running a food truck in South Boston, near the harbor. "Chen's Kitchen," I told Richard when I reported back. "Open Tuesday through Saturday, 11 to 3, serves Asian fusion cuisine. According to several food bloggers I found, it's exceptional. Wait times average 45 minutes. Richard was quiet for a long moment. She did it. She actually did it. Yes, sir. She didn't need me at all. No, sir, she didn't. But I need her. He looked at me, and I saw something in his face I'd rarely seen before. Humility. Real humility, not the performed kind that rich people deploy to appear relatable. Jameson, how do I fix this? I don't know if you can, sir. But perhaps the question isn't how to fix it, but how to honor it. She taught you something valuable. The question is what you do with that lesson. The next day was a Tuesday. Richard put on jeans and a simple sweater, drove his old Honda Civic that he'd kept from his David Morgan days, and joined the line at Chen's kitchen. The truck was painted cheerful yellow with green lettering. There was a small service window, and behind it Richard could see movement, could smell garlic and ginger, and something incredible that made his mouth water. The line moved slowly. Richard didn't mind. It gave him time to think about what he'd say, how he'd apologize, how he'd ask for a second chance, not to date her or win her back, but simply to know her, to be worthy of knowing her. When he finally reached the window, Eliza looked up from the wok she was working, and her eyes widened. "Richard." "Hi," he said, and his voice came out rough. "I heard the wait times were worth it. Thought I'd see for myself." She stared at him for a long moment. The customer behind Richard coughed impatiently. Eliza seemed to shake herself. "What can I get you?" "Whatever you recommend. I trust your judgment." Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise? Pain? She turned away without responding, and Richard thought maybe he'd made a mistake coming here. But then she called back, "Give me 20 minutes. Have a seat at the picnic tables." Richard sat, waited. Watched as Eliza worked, her movements in the tight space of the food truck as graceful as they'd been in the Meridian's dining room. She was in her element here, he realized. This was hers, in a way the Meridian could never be. 23 minutes later, she emerged from the truck, carrying a plate. She set it in front of him without meeting his eyes, then sat down across from him. Braised short rib over forbidden rice with kimchi, scallions, and a soft egg. "It's what I'm working on for a restaurant menu someday." Richard looked at the dish. It was beautiful, artfully plated, even on a simple paper plate. He took a bite, and flavor exploded across his tongue. Rich, complex, perfectly balanced. It was, without exaggeration, one of the best things he'd ever eaten. "This is incredible," he said honestly. "Eliza, you're not just good, you're exceptional." "I know," she said simply, and it wasn't arrogance, just fact. "I've always known. I just needed the opportunity to prove it. I'm sorry I wasn't part of that opportunity. I'm sorry I wasn't part of giving you what you deserved." "You couldn't give me what I deserved, Richard, because what I deserved was to earn it myself. You were right about one thing, though. I was wasted at the Meridian, not because the work was beneath me, but because I was spending all my energy surviving Marcus instead of building my own dream. I heard you moved. New apartment. Cheaper area, but it's mine. I'm saving every dollar I make here. In a year, maybe 2, I'll have enough to open a real restaurant. Small, 20 seats, but mine." Richard wanted to offer to invest, to write her a check, to make her dream happen tomorrow. But he knew that would be the wrong thing. She didn't need his money. She needed to do this her way, and he needed to respect that. "I'm glad," he said instead. "You're going to be huge, Eliza. Food critics are going to fight over reservations. People are going to stand in line for hours." "Maybe," she said, "but that's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because cooking is how I show love, how I connect with people, how I make sense of the world. The success part, if it comes, is just a bonus." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Eliza spoke again. "I heard what you did at the Meridian. Kevin called me, told me about the changes you made. It was long overdue. I should have done it years ago. But you didn't. You did it after meeting me, after working there, after I called you a coward." She looked at him directly now. "Did you do it because of me?" "I did it because it was right," Richard said. But yes, you showed me what right looked like. You showed me that character matters more than I ever understood. 3 words you said that night. Character is everything. They've been echoing in my head ever since. Character is everything, she repeated softly, and you finally found yours. I'm trying to, every day. But Eliza, I didn't come here to tell you that. I came to tell you that I'm sorry. Not sorry because I want something from you, but sorry because you deserve better. You deserved honesty from the beginning. You deserved someone who would protect you instead of hiding behind strategy. You deserved David Morgan if he'd been real, and instead you got Richard Sterling pretending. Eliza was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was gentle. Here's what I've learned in the last 3 months. We're all pretending, Richard. We all wear masks. I wore a mask at the Meridian every single day, hiding how much I was hurting, how scared I was, how trapped I felt. The difference is whether our masks hide who we are or help us become who we want to be. You wore David Morgan like armor. But maybe, underneath, you were actually discovering who Richard Sterling could be. I don't know how to be that person yet, Richard admitted. None of us do. That's the thing about character. It's not something you have or don't have. It's something you build, choice by choice, day by day. You made bad choices. You hurt me. But you're making better choices now. That has to count for something. Does it count enough for you to forgive me? Eliza smiled, sad, but real. Forgiveness isn't a transaction, Richard. It's not something you earn or buy. But I think maybe I can understand you better now, and understanding is a start. Can I ask you something? Sure. That night, when you said money doesn't buy character, did you really believe that, or were you just angry? I believed it then, and I believe it now. But I also believe something else. Money is a tool. Like any tool, it can be used to build or to destroy. Marcus used his power to destroy. You're using yours to build. That's the difference. That's character. They talked for another hour. Not about the Meridian or what had happened, but about food and dreams and what made life meaningful. Richard told her about his childhood, about building his company, about feeling successful but empty. Eliza told him about her grandmother, about the restaurant her parents had lost, about her determination to honor their legacy by doing it differently. When Richard finally stood to leave, Eliza walked him back to his car. "Can I come back?" he asked. "To Chen's kitchen. Not to bother you, just to eat your food and maybe talk sometimes. You can come back," she said. "But Richard, I need you to understand something. I'm not looking for a savior or an investor or a romantic redemption story. I'm looking to build my own life on my own terms. If you can respect that, if you can be a friend without expectations, then yes. Come back." "I can do that," Richard said. "I promise." "Good, because I could use a friend. Especially one who finally understands that being rich doesn't make you important. Being good does." Richard came back the next Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. He became a regular at Chen's kitchen, one of dozens of people who waited in line for Eliza's exceptional food and her warm service. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't, but slowly, over months, something rebuilt between them. Not what they'd had before, but something different, something real. Richard learned to be a person instead of a persona. He learned that showing up mattered more than grand gestures. He learned that respect wasn't something you commanded, but something you earned through consistency and genuine care. And Eliza learned that forgiveness wasn't about excusing harm, but about refusing to let past harm define the future. That people could change if they were willing to do the hard work of becoming better. That maybe, just maybe, character wasn't everything you started with, but everything you chose to build. 18 months after that first meeting at the food truck, Eliza invited Richard to a private dinner. She'd scraped together enough money, combined with a small business loan and investors she'd carefully vetted, to open her restaurant. It was tiny, just 20 seats like she'd dreamed, in a converted storefront in Cambridge, but it was perfect. "I want you to be one of the first people to eat here," she told him. "Not because you're rich or because you own the Meridian, but because you're my friend and because you believed in me when believing in people wasn't something that came naturally to you." The restaurant was called Chen's Table, and it was everything Eliza had promised. Intimate, warm, filled with the aromas of her grandmother's recipes, reimagined with modern technique and love that you could taste in every bite. They sat across from each other at a small table near the window, and Richard looked at this woman who changed his life simply by refusing to compromise who she was, and felt something he'd rarely felt before. Genuine happiness, not the temporary high of a business success or a good deal, but deep, lasting contentment. "I'm proud of you," he said. "I'm proud of me too," she replied with a grin. "And Richard, I'm proud of you. The new Meridian is everything a restaurant should be. You did that. We did that. You showed me how." She raised her glass of wine. "To character and to second chances." "To character," Richard echoed, "the only thing that really matters." They clinked glasses, and in that moment, Richard understood that he'd gained something far more valuable than what he'd lost. He'd lost his illusions. He'd lost his comfortable distance from the world. He'd lost his certainty that success measured in dollars meant anything at all. But he'd gained himself, his real self, the person he was capable of being when he stopped hiding behind wealth and titles and strategic thinking. 6 months later, when Richard asked Eliza if she'd consider a partnership, not romantic but professional, merging Chen's Table with a revitalized Meridian to create something entirely new, she said yes, not because she needed him, but because she'd seen him become someone worth partnering with. Another 6 months after that, when Richard asked if she'd consider moving that partnership into something more personal, she said yes again. Because by then, Richard Sterling wasn't the man who'd lied to her in a staff room. He was the man who'd shown up every Tuesday for 2 years, who'd respected her boundaries, who'd proven through consistent action that character wasn't just a word, but a practice. They stood together in the kitchen of their combined restaurant, now called the Meridian Table, and Richard thought about the journey from that night in March 1987 when he'd decided to go undercover. He'd thought he was investigating embezzlement. Instead, he'd investigated himself and found himself deeply wanting. But that discovery, painful as it was, had been the beginning of everything that mattered. Because Eliza had been right all along. Character was everything. Money couldn't buy it. Power couldn't fake it. Success couldn't substitute for it. Character was built in small moments of choice, when you decided who you wanted to be regardless of who you'd been. It was built in showing up, in honoring commitments, in treating people with dignity even when it wasn't convenient or profitable. It was built in admitting when you were wrong and doing the work to become better. 2 years after that, Richard and Eliza stood in the same kitchen, but this time Richard was on one knee, holding a small box. Inside wasn't a massive diamond. It was a simple gold band, and inside the band was an engraving. "Character is everything." "This isn't me trying to buy you or impress you," Richard said. "This is me asking if you'd want to build a life together, the same way we built this restaurant, with honesty, partnership, and mutual respect. I'm not the same person I was when we met, Eliza. You changed me. You saved me from a life that looked successful, but felt empty. I don't deserve you, but I'd spend every day trying to become someone who does." Eliza looked at him, this man who'd once been a stranger in disguise, and then a painful lesson, and finally, slowly, someone she could imagine a future with. She thought about character, about choices, about the long road from that March night to this moment. "You already are," she said softly. "You've been proving it every day for 3 years. So yes, Richard, yes, I'll marry you." They kissed in that kitchen, surrounded by the smells of garlic and rosemary and fresh bread, and it was perfect. Not perfect like a fairy tale, but perfect like real life, messy and complicated, and earned through hard work and genuine change. I stood in the back of that kitchen, watching, and felt a rare surge of emotion. I'd served Richard Sterling for 15 years, but I'd only respected him for the last 3, because only in the last 3 years had he become someone worthy of respect. That's what Eliza had given him, not love, though that came too, not success, though the restaurant flourished under their partnership. She'd given him a mirror that showed him who he really was and the courage to become someone better. Character is everything. 3 words. They destroyed Richard Sterling and rebuilt him into someone worth being. As I watched them together, planning their wedding while simultaneously planning the next week's menu, I thought about all the wealthy people I'd served over the years. The ones who believed their money made them superior, that their success meant they'd earned the right to treat others as lesser. Richard had believed that too once. But he'd learned the hardest lesson life can teach, that worth isn't measured in what you own, but in who you become when faced with the choice between comfort and character. He'd chosen character, finally, and it had cost him everything comfortable and given him everything that mattered. If this story has moved you, I need to ask you something. In the comments below, tell me, have you ever witnessed injustice and stayed silent, or found the courage to speak up? Your story matters. Share it with us. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who needs to be reminded that courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting despite it, share this video with them. Sometimes the stories that change us are the ones we pass along. Until next time, remember what Eliza taught Richard, what life has taught me through 40 years of service. True wealth isn't measured in what we own, but in who we become when no one is watching. Character is everything. Everything else is just noise.